Welcome back to Big Country Politics on KTAB.
Hello and welcome to this week's Sunday Conversation here on Big Country Politics. I'm Manny Diaz. This week our special guest is Taylor Giorno. She is the business and lobbying reporter for our sister outlet in Washington, D.C., thehill.com. Taylor, thanks for hanging out with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Manny.
Well, Taylor, there's you wrote a number of pieces earlier this week on the Federal Trade Commission banning non-compete agreements. This hit the wire on Tuesday. Federal Trade Commission it voted 3-2 on all this. First, before we kind of get into what this is going to do for a lot of different industries, tell us about what this ruling is, and certainly what it means.
Absolutely. So as it stands right now, the Federal Trade Commission estimates that around 18% of the U.S. workforce, so around 30 million people, are currently covered by non-compete agreements. So those are agreements that basically prevent an employee from leaving to go work for a competitor or leaving to start a competing business. However, under the new FTC rule, which is supposed to go into effect in 120 days, but it's already facing some legal challenges, so TBD on that. That would completely ban all future non-compete agreements. And it also goes back and retroactively tells employers, hey, you have to throw out these existing non-compete agreements and let current and former employees know that they're not going to be enforcing it anymore. In an update from the original rule that was proposed in January 2023, however, it carves out the final rule carves out an exemption for some senior executives who are still going to be subject to those non-compete agreements.
How far back? I mean, because I've even had, because here in the media industry, which we'll get into here in a bit, because this is set to impact the media industry quite a bit. How far back is this could this be impacting these non-compete clauses in these contracts?
It's all existing non-compete clauses. So any non-compete agreement that's out there, it's active. It's going to fall under this non-compete ban. And so employees, look out. You should be getting a notification from your employer once this rule goes into effect. But again, the timeline for that is uncertain.
Do you anticipate, this getting tied up? Perhaps maybe some of the bigger companies like Nexstar, the other brand X companies that aren't Nexstar, kind of battling this and tying this up in the courts?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen anything from some media companies, but big business groups have already come out in force against this rule. So specifically on Wednesday morning, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is this massive pro-business lobbying group in Washington, D.C., the Business Roundtable, and a few other business groups actually filed a lawsuit suing the FTC and its chair, Lina Khan, who's a Biden appointee, basically arguing that the agency overstepped its authority and trying to block the rule from going into effect. So that court challenge and any subsequent ones that come up are likely going to extend the runway for implementing this actual rule.
Now, you follow a lot of business and lobbying. That's kind of your beat with thehill.com. Was it surprising to see something like this? I mean, after all, the Biden administration kind of has been saying this is kind of on our agenda.
Yeah, absolutely not. This is President Biden's bread and butter. He really loves to cast himself as the most pro-union president in history, on the side of workers. Back in the fall, we saw him on the picket line of the United Auto Workers Union strikes when they were striking against the Big Three. As head of his State of the Union as well, earlier this year, his administration rolled out a whole agenda where he was going after price gouging. His administration has really focused on how they're cracking down on junk fees. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau issued a rule last month that would cap credit card late fees at $8, which is about a 75% cut from their average of $32. And I will say also on the flip side of that, the challenge from the chamber and these other business groups is also to be expected. The chamber also filed a lawsuit to block the CFPB's rule capping credit card late fees last month, and they signaled ahead of this final rule that they were going to do the same thing.
We're going to take a quick commercial break. We are with Taylor Giorno. She is a staff writer for thehill.com, a business and lobbying reporter. When we come back, we're talking more of the politics of this particular ruling, plus how this will impact a few industries, certainly like the broadcast industry. That and more right here on Big Country Politics. Stay with us.
Welcome back to Big Country Politics on KTAB.
Well, welcome back to Big Country Politics. This is our Sunday conversation. This week, our special guest is Taylor Giorno. She is a staff writer, reporter for thehill.com. She writes about business and lobbying there in Washington, D.C. This week's topic is right in her wheelhouse. It's the Federal Trade Commission's vote, 3-2 vote to ban most non-compete agreements, as what Taylor wrote in her piece, a watershed moment for the U.S. workforce that faces an uncertain future. Taylor, before we went to break, you touched a little bit on, the politics of this. Do you envision, I'm not asking you to be political correspondent here, but do you perhaps maybe foresee, if you had a crystal ball, that how maybe this could be something that's talked about come closer to November as Biden and Trump certainly go head to head?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, President Biden really has cast himself as I'm the pro-worker president, and he's going to be going back to his track record as it relates to what his administration has done on these non-compete agreements, what they've done on the credit card late fee, what they've done on price gouging, as really using that as a stark dichotomy to former President Trump, the presumed Republican nominee. And that's going to be super important because right now Biden is not polling well when it comes to his handling of the economy. Voters really see former President Trump, according to a CBS News poll that was put out last month, as somebody who would do a better job at handling the economy. So Biden really wants to cast himself as, hey, I'm somebody who's going to be there helping workers, fighting for you. That being said, it's really interesting, actually, Manny, because on Capitol Hill, Congress has not passed a bill that would give the FTC the authority to ban non-compete agreements. But there are multiple bipartisan bills that have been introduced to this Congress that would limit non-compete agreements to some level. So I do think that this will be sort of a talking point that Biden will be bringing up on the campaign trail. As I mentioned, I don't know if some of these court cases are going to get resolved before then. But even though there is some bipartisan agreement on limiting non-competes, not just at the congressional level, but even the Republican commissioners who voted against banning non-compete agreements said, we don't support non-compete agreements carte blanche. But I think that you'll see in the presidential election that maybe Biden's going to try to draw a harder, starker line than even maybe how some Republicans and Democrats are split on this issue of non-compete agreements.
So essentially, this becomes almost, a Republican, versus Democrat type of thing overnight.
Yeah. Which in our age of political division is not entirely unexpected. However, I do think it's worth noting that this is an area of policy where lawmakers across the aisle, policymakers across the aisle do have at least some area of overlap. And so I would definitely be watching to see if Congress decides to potentially move on legislation related to this in the future, and as well as what happens with these court cases challenging the agency's rulemaking ability.
Let's talk about how this impacts certain business sectors. Two that you mentioned are healthcare and technology. The other is media, which we'll touch on here in a bit. But tell me how this could affect the technology and healthcare systems here.
Yeah, so focusing on healthcare for a second, I mean, coming out of the pandemic, we saw that industry in such upheaval. There was high demand for labor, but also a lot of people that were hemmed in by these non-compete agreements. It makes it a lot harder for them to leave a job, to seek better pay, better working conditions. This would have a pretty big impact, particularly in the for-profit healthcare space. And the same for tech workers. A lot of tech startups will have these non-compete agreements. And it's not just in California. We think of California, Silicon Valley as sort of the bastion of this, but these tech startups are all over the country. And by banning these non-compete agreements, it kind of opens some of these companies up to bringing people on board. You have this innovative idea, and there's a risk that an employee that you bring on that you're trying to help build a business with leaves and goes elsewhere, or worse, maybe starts a business that's going to compete with this new innovative business you've come up with. I will note, however, a lot of people have the business community has said this is bad. It's not going to protect our trade secrets. We're opening ourselves up to that information getting out there. There are other ways that companies can protect that information. A lot of lawyers have pointed out in the wake of this ruling that the rule does not ban confidentiality agreements or non-disclosure agreements. So I do think that particularly in those spaces, you'll see probably two things. One will be the increased use of those mechanisms to protect proprietary information. And two, frankly, companies are, if the rule goes into effect, going to have to compete for labor. Coming out of the pandemic, we saw this really hot labor market where companies were offering higher wages, better benefits, and that is definitely a tool that they may have to lean more on to attract the employees that they want and get them also to stay.
Well, for print folks, I know you're not print, you're close to it, you're a cousin of it, you're digital. But the folks in your world have been known to kind of move around a little bit more. Not that broadcast folks have not, but the screws get tightened a little bit more on broadcast personalities when it comes to these, non-compete contracts. Tell me how this could impact certainly the broadcast media world.
Absolutely. I mean, as it would impact the broadcast media world, viewers may be seeing their favorite anchor on one station on a Friday, and then they'll tune into another station on a Monday, and they'll see that person has moved to a different broadcasting station. Like you said, that is something that is much more common in print, particularly in a very saturated market like Washington, D.C. Journalists move around. But I do think that if non-competes are banned, you might see a little bit more moving around and shuffling in the broadcast market. Alternatively, you could see broadcast management starting to pay their top talent more, investing more in training them, and really giving them incentives to stay in their current job. I can ask you, Manny, how do you think that the non-compete agreements are going to impact the broadcasting space?
Wow, now we're turning the tables here. I've been in this broadcast media industry for a little over 15 years now, and I've never had to experience something like this. So this could be very different. This is uncharted waters, if you will. And so the next 180 days, however, is 120 days? They should be kind of interesting to see how this necessarily shakes up. So we'll experience it together. How about that, Taylor?
Yeah, absolutely.
All righty. Well, Taylor, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
For Taylor Giorno, staff writer, reporter for thehill.com, our sister outlet in Washington, D.C. I am Manny Diaz. This has been another Sunday conversation right here on Big Country Politics. We'll see you next time. God bless.